How close America came to leaderless power. There are moments in history when leadership doesn't fall, it thins. Authority still exists, but direction disappears. This was one of those moments when America came closer than anyone realized to having power. Without leadership, the warning signs weren't dramatic. There was no coup, no vacuum declared. The presidency remained occupied. Institutions functioned, yet coordination failed quietly, and decisions stopped producing alignment. The disconnect between the authority the presidency held and the cooperation it could actually generate had reached a point where the two were no longer meaningfully connected. To understand how close America came to leaderless power, we have to look at the space between authority and action. The president still held legal control, but the system no longer waited for direction. Agencies moved independently. Leaders hedged. Everyone prepared for uncertainty. This is the most dangerous phase of governance. Not chaos, fragmentation. The White House issued guidance meant to stabilize the moment. It arrived too late, too softly, or too cautiously. The response was polite, professional, and optional. Inside the administration, the fear wasn't overthrow. It was drift. The realization that leadership was no longer anchoring outcomes. That decisions were becoming suggestions. That coordination was dissolving into parallel survival. America was not leaderless on paper. It was leaderless in practice. And once that gap opens, power becomes unpredictable. Not because anyone seeks control, but because no one feels responsible for the whole. This was the moment the nation came closest to discovering what happens when authority remains, but leadership evaporates. And what followed would determine whether that condition became permanent. As fragmentation spread, the system began behaving in ways no constitution anticipates. Agencies coordinated laterally instead of vertically. Decisions were made based on local risk, not national strategy. Each actor assumed someone else would provide direction. Eventually, that moment never came. The White House waited for conditions to stabilize enough to reassert direction. But conditions did not stabilize. They shifted, and with each shift, the system adapted further to operating without central guidance. Inside the White House, urgency turned into containment. The goal was no longer to lead decisively, but to prevent visible breakdown. Silence was avoided publicly, but privately, clarity was scarce. Every path forward risked exposure. The president still spoke, but the system no longer leaned in. Messages were received, interpreted, and quietly adjusted to fit individual priorities. Authority existed, but follow-through fractured. This is how leaderless power emerges. Not through rebellion, not through takeover, but through dispersion. No one sees control. Everyone simply stopped waiting. The absence of clear leadership did not produce a power grab. It produced a quiet, distributed independence that felt pragmatic in the moment, but represented a fundamental departure from how the system was designed to function. The most unsettling part was how functional everything appeared. Services continued. Orders were processed. The government didn't stop working. It stopped working together. By the time leadership recognized how deep the drift had gone, reversing it required something impossible to demand. Collective belief. Belief that alignment still mattered. Belief that coordination was worth the risk. Belief that the center could still hold. Without that belief, authority became symbolic. And America moved closer to a reality few had ever imagined. A nation governed by motion without direction. As days passed, the danger deepened in ways few could see. The absence of clear leadership didn't produce chaos. It produced habits. New routines formed around uncertainty. Decision-making decentralized not by design, but by necessity. This is how leaderless power becomes normalized. Not through a single dramatic event, but through the gradual formation of habits that make leadership seem unnecessary. Each day without clear direction from the center reinforces the lesson that the system can manage without it. Agencies stopped escalating issues upward. They solved problems locally, accepting inconsistency as the cost of speed. Coordination calls grew quieter. Fewer voices spoke. Fewer assumptions were shared. Each unit focused on avoiding blame rather than achieving alignment. Inside the White House, the realization was grim. The presidency still had authority, but authority was no longer the system's reflex. Direction had become optional. Compliance had become situational. This was not disobedience. It was adaptation. The system had learned how to function without guidance. And once that happens, leadership must work twice as hard just to be noticed. Every instruction competes with momentum already in motion. The most dangerous part was psychological. People stopped expecting a unifying signal. They stopped waiting for it. And once expectation disappears, leadership loses gravity. America was not collapsing. It was drifting. And drift, unlike crisis, does not announce itself. It feels manageable, temporary, correctable later, until later arrives and nothing recenters. This was the point where leaderless power stopped being a fear and became a condition that did not feel alarming because it arrived gradually and because the system continued to function well enough that the absence of central leadership could be rationalized as a temporary inconvenience rather than a structural crisis. When the moment finally passed, America never officially acknowledged how close it had come. There was no declaration that leadership had thinned, no warning that power had begun operating without direction. Life simply continued, and the system slowly stitched itself back together. But it did not return unchanged. The presidency regained visibility, yet something fundamental had shifted. The assumption that leadership would always arrive in time was gone. Institutions remembered how to function without waiting. Autonomy, once learned, does not disappear. It becomes part of the institutional knowledge of every agency and department that experienced a period of leaderless power. The memory of having managed without central direction creates a permanent alternative to compliance, one that can be activated anytime confidence in the center wavers again. This is the quiet legacy of coming close to leaderless power. Not collapse, not chaos, but memory. A memory inside the system that alignment is fragile. That authority alone does not guarantee coordination. That leadership must be constantly reinforced, not merely assumed. America did not cross into leaderlessness, but it saw the edge. And once a nation sees how easily direction can dissolve, it becomes more cautious or more vulnerable, depending on who leads next. History often focuses on moments when power is seized or lost. It rarely lingers on moments when power almost becomes meaningless. This was one of those moments, a reminder that leadership is not defined by title or law, but by belief, shared, renewed, and protected. Without that belief, the most powerful office in the world becomes indistinguishable from an empty room with an important address. And when that belief fades, even briefly, the consequences echo far longer than the silence that caused them. The system that has experienced the absence of leadership carries that experience forward, and it shapes how institutions respond to every future moment of uncertainty, making the next episode of Drift both more likely and more difficult to reverse. So what do you think? How close can a system come to leaderless power before it no longer finds its way back? Subscribe to join the journey.